Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to season 2, episode 2 of Man Buns and Jesus. We're so glad you're joining us this morning, evening, afternoon, whenever you're listening to it. And before we get into the podcast, I just have to say, my elders are so complimentary of this podcast that last night at the elders meeting, they all showed up with wigs in man buns, and it was just we have a fan base, fellas. We have a fan base. So that's my introduction to the show. What are we talking about today, Ben?
Well, Josh, today on our podcast, we have a friend of mine who I have known since high school, or maybe he's had the displeasure of knowing me since high school.
That's probably more accurate.
Yeah, he's a pastor, a friend, a dog dad, if I remember correctly. Perhaps the most agriculturally minded suburbanite I've ever known in my life. One of the few men ever happy to move to the state of Nebraska and would not mind getting paid his yearly salary in heads of cattle. Our guest today is the Reverend Ryan Mazer. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you, Ben and Josh. It's good to be here today. And what you said is absolutely true. I was super excited to discover that my first call was back to the state of Nebraska. And state of Nebraska is pretty cool. It gets a really terrible rap everywhere else in the country. But, you know, when your number one sector is agriculture, no farms, no food. So
I gotta tell you, I thought you were just gonna stop at when you're number one.
Well, yeah, there's that part too. So, Nebraskans have this big bias about themselves too. So
I gotta say
the
though,
state
Ben,
motto is it's not for everyone.
Yeah, that's
Ben,
right.
I'm really disappointed that you didn't include his points per game in seminary basketball in your introduction. I feel like that's a failure.
We could go all the way back to his high school production,
and you will be censured appropriately.
Yeah,
that's fair. Yep. That's fair. Anyway, so we have Ryan on the podcast today because, as I said, he is perhaps the most agriculturally minded suburbanite I've ever known in my life, in part because he didn't spend his whole life in suburbia. But over the years, I have watched him foster and grow a passion for agriculture, for gardening, for God's creation. And we wanted to have him on to talk about why we should care about these things. And perhaps for those of you who are interested in getting into gardening, what's a starting place? But first off, Ryan, tell us a little bit about your love of gardening.
Yeah. I'll just kind of give a brief overview of kind of how I was raised. I was kind of raised in the best of both worlds. As Ben, you put it, I was kind of the country hick in suburbia, which is an interesting mix. But I grew up with the best of both worlds. My parents both grew up on dairy farms in eastern Minnesota, western Wisconsin. And from a very young age, anytime I was out on the farm, working with the cattle, working in the field, doing everything I could. Now, my parents decided to go back into Lutheran education. And so they bounced around kind of in the Twin Cities area, working at schools. And that's kind of how I crossed paths with Ben in high school. And really that passion of being a farmer has always been there. But yet I knew myself well enough. I probably could not be out on my own without people for a very long time. And God got a hold of my heart kind of when I was in high school for ministry. And I decided to pursue that path for a career. And it's been nothing short of rewarding, of being able to serve people where they're at, to be involved in the lives of people, and also to bring Jesus to them as well. But yet that passion for farming has never gone away either. And Josh and Ben can both attest to this. Even when I was at seminary, they allowed me to have a garden there. For me, there's just something about getting my hands dirty, to still have that connection to the land, and also everything that comes with it, tinkering around, working on projects. Right now, I have a garden started, and also I have a chainsaw torn apart. And hey,
now I got a question for you, Ryan. For those of you listening and or watching, Um, when he says garden, like, I don't want you to think like I have a patio and I have 4 plants on it,
Right.
or like
Right.
I have a little garden where I have a tomato plant and a pepper plant. When he says garden at the seminary, this thing was like as big as a house. Okay, this was a small field. So let's put that in context.
Yeah.
Ryan
Yeah.
is an overachiever when it comes to gardening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
So my
And
question: how big's the garden you're talking about now?
let's see. Keeps on growing a little bit. But it's approximately, I don't know, 16 by 18, 18 by 16, somewhere around there. So
paltry
he,
compared to the one on the seminary campus.
yeah, yeah,
Just
yeah.
no pittance.
So, yeah. As a matter of fact, this morning I just put a few more wood posts in, so we're building a fence around it and everything. So, so yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Love anything that has to do with outdoors. I'm also into fishing, hunting, still get my hands dirty with animals in that way. Um, but any chance I can, I love being out there, being connected to God's creation ultimately. Um, so yeah, I'm very thankful for my wife who puts up with it too. Like a very special person in that way. Um, but really, it gets back to, kind of Christian's connection to creation is probably where I want to go with it. Um, right away we find in Genesis, 1 and 2, God made Adam to out of from the dust of the earth, to be the caretaker of the creation. That was really man's first vocation, was to take care of the garden. Now, a garden in that sense, like Josh, you said, is not a patio. It's not even, the size that I have, but it's the whole world. Um, and so God made man to, take care of the animals, to, prune the trees, to till the earth and everything else. It's only in Genesis 3 where we find that all of a sudden that work got messy, that it got difficult. There were weeds, thorns, everything else that became an issue. And so really that's a huge reason why farming, agriculture, gardening, all of that is important for us, even today. Um, Now, there's a lot of interesting things that have happened, in the past several decades where, less and less people are tied to the land. Only about 1 to 2% of Americans today farm. And so you're talking, just a few thousand people in that sense, or a few million, I guess. Um, but really, it's kind of been our deal since the beginning, and that's how man has been originally designed, to work. And really, even today, the jobs that we find are derived from agriculture. Farming, and agribusiness and everything else are the bedrock of our society. And it's real simple to think about. If we didn't have farms, if we didn't have food, if we didn't have, the snacks and everything else that we have, there would be no civilization. And
You know what
especially
they
in,
say?
yeah,
Corn makes whiskey.
yeah, yep, yep, and even those good things too. So,
Don't
um,
forget, the rain makes the corn now.
That's
yep,
true.
yep,
And God makes the rain, but I don't think that's in. Um,
yep.
I hearing you say all this stuff, Ryan, makes me wonder, because you're 100% right. I mean, obviously, um, in that agriculture and this connection to land was the first profession, was the first vocation, which is interesting because when you say the oldest profession, that's not what people think about. Um,
Right,
but
right.
but I wonder, and maybe this is something either of you guys have thought about. I wonder if how far removed we've gotten from that
Mm,
has
mhm,
had a negative impact um, on our spiritual health
mm,
as humanity, right? Um, and not to say that I think everyone should drop everything and go out and work a farm,
mhm,
but I wonder if even if we were more connected to small things like gardening and stuff, I wonder what the connection is to spiritual health, and maybe you guys can weigh in on that. But that's where my head's going when I'm hearing you talk about this stuff.
Yeah,
It-
yeah.
If I can jump in before you start going, Ryan, because I know that I'm going to lose you for 5 minutes here. um, Josh, I think that your thought there is like more accurate than maybe we give it credit for. I spent last weekend, my wife and I were transplanting it was originally about a 12-foot tall bush that was in our backyard.
It's a tall bush.
Yeah, slightly toxic to dogs, so we wanted to move it so that when we fence in the yard, our terror of a canine didn't attempt to eat it and die. Yeah. But I spent most of Friday and Saturday digging a hole, and it was amongst the most rewarding work that I think I've done in the last month, and that includes preaching an Easter sermon, right? Yep. So like
what's the highlight of your last month? Was it Easter? Nah, I dug a great hole.
It was a lot of fun. And like hauling wheelbarrows of dirt away, and the whole thing was great. But I think there's definitely something to like that original passion that God gave us to tend to the earth, to care for the creation he gave us. It is certainly there in a lot of us. And I vividly remember a conversation I had with you, Mazer. I think it was at soccer on some random weekday afternoon at the seminary, and you said that you had been bored all day, and because you couldn't find anything else to do, you went and weeded your garden, and like that was your cure to boredom. And not only was that your cure to boredom, but that was something you joyfully wanted to do. And I just think back to that and go, man, you're crazy.
Yeah.
But also too, like, I hate getting into that kind of work, but once you're in it, yeah, there is some joy to it.
Yeah.
I think that means you guys have better knees than I do.
Yeah. I guess there's kind of two things that come to mind. One is probably the disclaimer. It kind of happens to be the Nebraska state de facto motto is, it's not for everyone. But at the same point too, there is something to it. I go back to Genesis quite a bit, and you see how man was created in the image of God. Now, you can parse that out so many different ways, but one of the big things is kind of the creative element that God passed on to man in the original design, And when you looked at Adam and Eve, he said, yeah, you guys are very good. You guys are perfect. You guys are complete. And one of those things within the image of God is, the ability to create, the ability to, dig a hole, move some dirt, and, have things form more and more to how we desire, right? That's all part of what it means to be the caretakers of creation in that sense. But yeah, having that desire to create, no matter if it's gardening or, graphic arts or music or whatever else, kind of passion that you may have, all that is, I firmly believe within us, people, humans. So that hasn't been lost in the fall. Now, certainly those things can be, kind of distorted, right? Where, our passion to move dirt, has created problems for creation, right? Not to, jump on, a political issue, but,
jump away.
We do it all the
kind
time.
of what we do.
Yeah. One example is like, okay, the issues concerning, open pit mining, right? You're moving a ton of dirt for open pit mining. Now that has impacted, the environment in several different ways, right? It has released toxic, things into, ecosystems and so forth. And so there's negative consequences to a lot of our actions, right? But as far as, you getting out on a Sunday afternoon and moving a tree or something. Yeah, that's a little slice of, of that creative spirit that God has given you. So does that kind of get after it a little bit there, Josh?
Yeah,
It's kind of,
in a much more positive way, I think, because my curiosity is, and I don't think we're gonna have to wait until we can ask God in person about this, but has there been a negative like spiritual effect for individuals who are so far removed from that?
yeah, yeah.
Right? Because and I don't know if I would go far as to say I feel it spiritually, but like I feel a little bit of a disconnect because like I live in an apartment, and even previous apartments I've lived in, they've been in really old buildings, and I've done a lot of work for
Mhm,
the owner, right?
mhm,
And at the place we lived in Florida, we replaced all the lights, we replaced faucets, we replaced closet doors, we painted, which I didn't enjoy, but the rest of it was good. But like
mhm.
we live in a fairly nice, fairly new apartment complex, and have a very helpful maintenance team. So like even the filters for our air conditioners, they come in, they say, hey, we need to come by and change your filter.
Mm,
Like they
mhm.
take care of everything. And I mean, we have a couple potted plants on our balcony, but it's like that's like
Mhm,
especially
mhm.
compared to what you're doing, that's not a garden. That's nothing. Um,
It's
and
something though.
like, there's a
Yeah.
little bit of this disconnect where
Mm,
like I'm
mhm,
not I'm not doing the creative stuff. I'm not my hands aren't I'm not touching dirt very
mhm,
frequently.
mhm,
Um, which
mhm.
just reminds me of the never mind, not important. Uh,
Yeah. No, I mean, you're exactly onto something there. Is okay, how does someone like in your situation rediscover that spirit, if you will, right? How do you reconnect to the land in a way, right? How do you reconnect to, the vocation of man? And yeah, it doesn't have to mean, going out and filling your patio with dirt and, ticking off your landlord or anything in that way. It can
I'd
seem,
get fined for
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
I'd get
So
fined
don't do
heavily
it,
for that.
right? But thinking of all the different ways, and I even posed this for my confirmation kids too. Like last night, we just talked about the fourth article, or not fourth article, fourth petition of Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread, and really the emphasis there is um, not taking things for granted, right? So okay, especially in our world and society too, if you got $5, you can go to just about any drive-through and get something, right? And our food sources are very accessible. We thrive on convenience and everything else, um, which is fine, but it really fosters that negative disconnect, right, between us and God's creation. So, what are some ways that we can bridge that? Well, a lot of communities have like farmers markets, right? Where you can go, where you can, browse, the things that are growing, in your area. But then also there's the people behind the tables too. And chances are those people are the ones who brew the produce, pop the popcorn, whatever it may be. And supporting those people, yeah, can go a long ways in becoming reconnected. Um, the again, if you got $5 and you go to your local supermarket, grocery store, right, you can pick out just about anything that's in season or out of season, and it's there. um, Big thing about farmers markets is usually it's stuff that's in season, right? You're not going to go to a farmer's market in my part of Nebraska today and expect to find strawberries, right? Strawberries are typical, July, August thing, and you know, and that's just how it goes. Now, Josh, where you're at in California, those things are probably a little more year round, and
You
you
can
guys are shipping
grow
it,
pretty much anything, pretty much whenever you want here.
yeah, yeah, and so you
Whether
guys
you
are
should or
shipping
not
it,
is a different question.
You
yeah.
say, is it good or not?
Whether you should or not is a different
Oh
question.
yeah, we're not.
There's water
We're not gonna touch
resources
that one.
involved
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
And the other thing
So
is,
that-
you said you can go to a grocery store with $5 and get something. You're
Right.
funny. You're a funny
Right.
guy. You can't get
Um,
a gallon of gas for $5 out here.
Yeah. And I mean, that brings up another good point too, Ben, with like the water crises, that we find in the Southwest. Even here in Nebraska, our water table has really dropped in the past, I don't know, couple decades. And it really brings up the question of sustainability too. Uh, why should Christians care about agriculture? Well, it impacts our resources too. Um, and sustainable practices are all a part of, yeah, not only who God designed us to be originally as caretakers of the creation, but also the um, current care of His creation even today. If we're depleting, resources in order to make sure that there's fresh strawberries, in Michigan in February, okay, we should maybe think about that, right? We should maybe slow down and think about, yeah, maybe there was something to the practices of, the generations before us when they would, grow things, preserve them, and that's what you lived on in the wintertime, kind of brings up, it questions the whole idea of convenience in our world. And it's countercultural and it's not popular, but again, it's something that we should, as Christians, start thinking about. That God's creation is not something to exploit, but it's something for us to care for.
So you heard it here first. Lutheran pastor says we should abandon the state of California and move to where the water table is more accessible
Now,
and steady.
the northern half of the state is not a desert.
Okay, so we should abandon the southern half of California and probably all of Arizona.
You know what?
Yeah.
I gotta tell you, there are probably a lot of Southern Californians who agree with you. Like 12% of the population moved out in the last year.
Mm.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So I guess where I kind of go is and Ben, you can correct me if I'm going too off track here, but when you talk about sustainability, I wonder about things like just environmentalism in general. What's the faithful stance? And I suspect the faithful stance is like we should really care about we should care about God's creation, right? And I'm fairly confident that a lot of Christians, especially in the circles that we run in, gentlemen, the LCMS circles, maybe they get a little nervous about environmentalism because it's not, how do I say this tactfully? It's not an issue of their preferred political party.
Mm-hmm.
Was I tactful, subtle, at least a little bit?
Subtle enough. I actually on Sunday Bible study, we're walking through the catechism, and we did our Bible study this last
Must
Sunday.
Be a big catechism.
I mean, yeah, it's several hundred pages, and when you lay them out end to end, you can do quite a bit of walking there. But we were talking about the Father as creator and our place under that. One of the implications of that being, if our Father is creator, and we talk about him having created for the love of it, and we talk about ourselves having at least some shadow of the image of that creating spirit in us, we should also want to care for the thing that he's given us to care for in that same loving way. And that means trying to do things that aren't destructive to it. And we had all of these conversations throughout Bible study about what we can do. And at the end, one of the women in the congregation, you know who you are if you're listening to this podcast, came up to me and said, we really need to just stop being a hypocrite. And I was like, yeah, you're right. We really do need to just stop being hypocrites.
It's
We
as
can
easy
talk
as
about,
that, folks.
yeah, we can talk about this all we want, but until we actually actively do something, it's not gonna change anything. And I think this ultimately kind of circles back to the like, get your hands dirty thing.
Mhm.
Um,
Yep.
don't just talk about it, but do something. Which is funny because we're going to spend 45 minutes here talking about it, and doing nothing.
Hey, I bet by the end of the day, Ryan has done some care of his garden.
That's fair. And I'm going to break up a bunch of sticks to bury them this afternoon.
There you
Let
go.
them naturally compost in the yard.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of getting back to Josh's question, what's the road to walk? And kind of there's, since you had, Dr. Rockenbach on here last week, I'll pull one of his things, stay out of the two ditches, right? The one ditch being um, recognizing, or overemphasizing too much the exploitation of creation, right? And the other ditch being, completely neglecting our vocation, right? Completely neglecting our vocation would mean, okay, well, creation is prime and man is just, a part of it, right? Certainly, to your point, Ben, we are creatures first and foremost. And I think in a way that puts us back, into creation, recognizing that we're just not, the Lord's over creation, but we're also fellow creatures. That when I, go home and see my dog, here in a few hours, hey, she's a fellow creature, right? That deer, that I go hunting for, that fish that I catch, yeah, those are fellow creatures. Now God has given them to me, to provide for my need, right? And even my dog, I'm not going to eat my dog, but she's there as companion, right?
That's a relief. I was
So
really worried about that, Ryan.
yeah.
Poor Edith.
Yep. Yeah. And so, recognizing that, yeah, I am a creature, but also I'm also made in the image of God. And although that's broken, that also includes that I'm, a caretaker. And so it's kind of looking to another example. A big issue here in the state of Nebraska and other Midwestern states is sustainable farming practices, right? And we kind of saw the consequences of unsustainable practices in the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl era, right? Where people were just on a tear to plow up, several millions of acres of land and try and squeeze as much as they could out of, the soil. And of course, that led to, big massive dust storms and all these terrible consequences that ruined the lives of millions. So since then, there's been better practices to, till, to care for, the land and everything else. But even today, questions concerning, pesticides, herbicides, all these different things. As Christians, I mean, you walk that middle road, right? Because on the one hand, we need farms to provide food, right? Not just food for the individual farm family, but the average farmer today feeds on average, a few hundred people, which is crazy to think about. But again, it gets back to only 1% to 2% of Americans are farmers today. And so, yeah, we need those farmers. We need them to be as efficient as they possibly can with the resources that they have. But again, where's that line? Where's that other ditch of completely exploiting, the land, draining wetlands to, produce more farmland, and all those different things, right? How much Roundup do you dump, before it starts leading to other issues?
Starts to give people cancer.
Right, exactly. And I've
Well,
known several individuals who have, experienced the negative effects of those things too. So
I think I think this is one of those issues that, like, almost it gets overthought, and it's one of those things. If you don't overthink it, I think a lot of this stuff is really common sense, right? It's because we talk about walking the middle road and treating resources, treating the environment with responsibility, and it's like if you want to drill down and try and make hard set rules for all sorts of things, I think you're going to have a really tough time.
Mhm.
But if you kind of just like step back and don't overthink it, a lot of it is like this makes so. For example, if you're a big tech company and you have a bunch of toxic runoff, don't overthink it. That should not be dumped in a
Right.
river, right? Like we're not advocating for anything crazy. Just kind of like with the Roundup and stuff. Like don't use enough of it that you're poisoning the next 7 generations of insects, right? They're not that sturdy. You don't
Right.
need that much poison. Like even with the littler things on a smaller scale, just you have a TV. Maybe think about if you can recycle or give it to someone before you just throw it in the dumpster. Like if you step back and think about a lot of these things, it makes a lot of sense. But I think we try to overthink it, and we try and make hard rules for everything, and it just I think this is something that resists that.
Yeah, and as Christians, you know, kind of the big question in our world today is, okay, how does my decision affect my bottom line, right? The big question is always most likely about money, right? And so as Christians, who's the idol, who's the God in our heart, right? Is it our bottom line, or is it the God who creates, sustains, redeems, and sanctifies, right? Um, if God is God over creation, wow, I should do my part in, being a fellow creature, but also being a good steward of the things that I have. Um, for example, not to put myself up on a pedestal or anything, but with the green
Ben did
grass,
that with the introduction.
yeah,
Don't worry about it.
yeah, that's fine. Well, gee. Uh, uh, but like,
We'll knock you off later.
yeah, that's fine. With spring coming here in Nebraska, green grass and everything, a question, came up now that my wife and I are homeowners is, okay, do we spray the lawn? We got dandelions popping up, all sorts of different weeds. And well, our dog thinks that she's a cow sometimes and she eats grass, right? Um, and it's like, no, we're not going to spray, because it could affect our dog, right? And okay, dandelions are there, but also they're everywhere too. And so it's kind of, again, walking that middle road. Yeah, it's a bummer that, we have dandelions and all these weeds, but also they're part of the creation too. But yet we recognize that they'll spread. But if we spray, it could affect our dog too. So it's all those questions, but again, getting to the bottom line, what is most important here too? Is it financial? Is it curb appeal, or is it the God who creates and provides, right? So
And looks like he's going to say something profound, but I know him, so I'm not.
You're not holding your breath.
I hope the podcast could hear that deep breathing that I was doing.
It's fair. So I think as we're talking through all of these things, I mean, yes, common sense answers make a lot of sense. But sometimes it's hard, like we've already kind of discussed. If you haven't really engaged the earth in a while, it's hard to think about where we can start to do that again. We just came out of winter here in Michigan in the last few weeks.
What is this? Winter?
It's when the earth gets cold that's supposed to happen. Anyway, Cali boy. We just came out of winter, and like I was thinking about all the things that I needed to do in the yard to prepare the yard, and we're getting ready to put in a garden for the first time, so we have to do all sorts of stuff to prepare for that. And like figuring out where in my brain or where in my plans to just re-engage in some of those things was tough, because there's so many different places that we could go. Like we live in a neighborhood that's not far from an old auto manufacturing facility, so we're in the process of getting our soil tested to see if it's even like possible for us to grow in our own soil, or if we need to truck in everything that we need to grow a garden. We our house and our the former owner of our house had a habit of burying plastic bottles, so we just find shreds of plastic all over yeah, I don't understand what was happening, but we just find like shreds of
I'm
plastic all over
genuinely
the yard.
confused. That seems
Me
like a
too.
lot of work.
Yeah, I think just when holes appeared, things would get buried, and then yeah, anyway, so we had to like pull all of these like random chunks of plastic out of the yard, and there were like pieces of plastic bag floating all over the place, and it was a pain. There were things that were wildly overgrown, and sometimes it could just, even on a like one home or one individual scale, seem incredibly overwhelming. So and that's as someone who has a ready access way to re-engage the earth.
Mhm.
If you're living in an apartment like Josh, and you don't have like a small scale piece of the earth that you own, that you can reasonably say, okay, I need to take care of this.
Mhm.
Josh's scope is now, well, I guess I have to take care of my apartment, and if I want to do something bigger, I guess the next step is the planet. What are some things that like we can reasonably do to small
Yeah.
scale engage
Mhm.
above
Mhm.
and beyond, especially for those who don't have like a built-in or go-to way to do that kind of thing?
I offered to reseed one of my congregation members' lawns, so that's how desperate I am at this point.
Yeah, that's impressive. But yeah, I think I brought up the farmers market example, right? Even if you can't grow it, go and check it out, go and support it, and yeah, talk with those folks. Um, you know, find any way that you can get yourself into God's creation, right? Outside of, the bounds of anything man made, right? Simply going to your local park, right? And taking in, the beauty that's there. Um, State park, going for hikes, right? Find a buddy who goes fishing or, does something else. That's an excellent way to get your hands literally in creation, right? Fishing is, very accessible in most areas and fairly inexpensive. And yet, taking a fish off the hook for the first time, hey, you're right there getting your hands dirty and slimy. And or it's, getting to Josh's point, right? If you're allowed to have, um, a ceramic pot or something on your patio, plant something in it, right? Or a house plant, or there's so many different things. One of the ways that my wife kind of got into it, since we've been married, is with succulent plants. They don't require a whole lot of care, but yet they just kind of do their own thing. And it's incredible to find all the different varieties and everything else. And she doesn't necessarily have a green thumb. She puts up with me and helps me out, but that's kind of her way of getting involved in reconnecting with God's creation in that sense. Um, Being a
That
part of
one that last one would be a good low effort way for anyone who's challenged mobility wise or energy level wise.
Yeah. Exactly.
In addition to lack of availability.
Yeah. Just to throw out a few others, a lot of communities have garden clubs too, and so if you don't have the space to, chances are someone in that club does. Or really the opportunities are endless. Now, granted, depending on where you're at, right? Bigger city, it may be more challenging to find those folks than small town Midwestern area. But urban farming is making a comeback though, and it just doesn't have to manifest itself in like what you're doing, Ben, or even Josh. There's urban beekeepers now, and so they have agreements with businesses or whatever where they're able to keep bees and collect honey and everything else. And so there's so many different ways to get involved. Some cities even allow homeowners to have chickens, right? 1 or 2 chickens. Go get yourself a pet chicken and learn how to raise it, keep it alive, and collect eggs and everything else.
We have a family. So right next door to the town that I live in Corona. Right next door is Norco, which is Horsetown, USA. They don't have sidewalks. They have horse paths. And we have a family. They have now 3 horses, like 8 chickens, a goat, 3 dogs, some number of cats. And all of this is in like a suburban neighborhood, right? Their neighbors' houses are like 10 feet away from theirs, and they have a stable in the backyard. It's just crazy. So go if you live in Norco, I guess go get chickens. I think I need a permit for
that. I think those are great suggestions, Mazer, and I feel like we're kind of coming to the end of our time today, and I think we've explored some pretty interesting aspects of how we can engage with the creation, care for the creation. But I have one final question for you, Mazer.
Yeah.
What are you most excited to grow this year?
Oh, that's a great question. We have all sorts of things lined up. I'm probably most anxious to see how my tomato plants will do. We haven't got them yet, but one of the things we love doing with our produce is it's something that was passed on to me as a kid, but my wife and I, we can our own produce. So, you pull out the mason jars and the water bath canner and you go at it. And so we're probably most excited to see how our tomatoes will do on the soil here. So hopefully they take off. And
I seem to recall while we were at the seminary together, you being late to a dinner because you were canning tomatoes and something exploded.
Yep. I don't, maybe it did explode, but always, my lesson in that is always make sure you have enough time, even for the unexpected. So,
So wise and esteemed.
I think we can call that his
I don't know if you really belong
day.
on this podcast.
Yeah. I'm still learning that. I mean, I was a little late to the office this morning because I was, putting posts in my garden, which you get some funny looks when your pastor is late because he was working in his garden. So
it shows your humanity. That's chef's kiss.
Yeah.
So I think that means it's time for takeaways. And like we've said before, we don't plan these shows, so I don't know if we warned Ryan about this, but how we close every show is just, if you had one thing that you could say, I want you to take one, as a listener, I want you to take one thing away from this podcast, what would that one thing be?
Yeah. My one thing would be rediscover who God created you to be. Just not in, individual gifts and talents, but also who you are as a creature who's been given a pretty important vocation. So.
What about you, Ben?
Oh, that's where my head immediately went. So I think I'll have to go with my backup plan here. And if you're going to can tomatoes, make sure you know how to do it before you start so that they don't explode and cause you to miss part of an important dinner.
Yes. Yep.
And my takeaway is this is one of the first podcasts. So I generally keep a note card where I make, like, as we go, I make notes to myself for like threads I want to pick up on or something like that. And this is, I think, the first time I've ever written notes, and they've all exclusively been like things I want to look into after the podcast. Um, so I'm really just excited, especially I know there's a farmer's market nearby. I think Tuesday nights or Wednesday nights they rent out a huge soccer field complex, and there's a huge farmer's market. So I want to look into checking that out. And then you mentioned garden clubs, and that sounds something that might be around somewhere out here. So I gotta do some Googling on that. But that's my takeaways. I'm excited to look into some of the stuff myself, because all I got's a patio. And turns out when you grow peppers in small pots, you get really small peppers.
Yep.
Which I should have known, but I didn't think about that. Some prayer ideas as you walk away from this podcast are just pray for creation, and pray especially for those things out of your control that impact creation, that God would work in people, that God would work in the world, to take care of his creation, and in full confidence that he does and he will. Pray for your involvement with the earth and all of the spiritual realities that go along with that. Anything else, Ben, Ryan?
I'd say pray for Ryan as he endures the hellscape that is Nebraska.
Oh, come
I just
on,
like giving you a hard
it's
time.
not that bad.
I did my vicarage there.
I thought it was my job to knock the Midwest. What are you doing?
There's a difference between Michigan and Nebraska. We have lakes. They just have corn.
Yep. Yeah. To all the listeners, don't knock it until you try it. Come visit. It's definitely a slice of God's creation, right? You got to look hard sometimes to find the beauty, but it's there, and it's pretty awesome once you get to see it. So
there are some great places in Nebraska. I don't mean to offend.
And there are some really great people.
Absolutely.
And if
like
you're
Ryan
a great
Mazer
person in Nebraska and you're looking for a church in, Platt? No, that was your vicarage.
No, Plattsmouth. Yeah. So we're about 20 miles south of Omaha. So yeah,
so
we're
if you're looking for a church, hit up our boy Ryan in that area. If in Lake Orion, Michigan, boom, Good Shepherd Lutheran Church with Pastor Ben Olschlager. And if you're in Southern California in the East Vale, Corona area, check out Edgewater Lutheran Church with this scrub as pastor. They haven't gotten rid of me yet. And I believe it's now shameless plug time. Notice I did the church thing before I said the plugs were shameless. Make sure to check us out on, we now have a Facebook page. So if you want to be a guest like Ryan just was, let us know, because we will let literally anyone be a guest on our show, and you can talk about pretty much whatever you want. My brother recently came and he said, I want to talk about the Romans and their power dynamic with Jesus. And I was like, sure. So at some point we're going to have my brother on and we're going to talk about the Romans. So you can go ahead and message us on Facebook or talk to us individually, and we'd be happy to have you. Or if you don't want to be on the show, but you have a topic you want us to tackle, let us know. That's actually where last week's podcast came from. And also, make sure to subscribe to this podcast on whatever your favorite podcasting platform is, whether that's Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whatever. Pandora is still reviewing our podcast, so I don't know what's up with that. But because we release extra content, we have these episodes that drop every Tuesday, but we release extra content, and the first instance of that was actually yesterday. And we don't put that out anywhere except for through the podcast. So if you want to hear it, if you want to see the extra stuff, which is crazy relative to what we normally talk about,
crazy is a bit strong.
crazy, chaotic maybe is a better word. But you got to subscribe on those podcasting platforms for that kind of stuff. So I think I'm all shameless plugged out, unless you're writing a book, Ryan.
Nope, not at the moment. So it would be cool.
So
to
maybe sometime in the future, look for Ryan Mazur's book. And other than that, brothers and sisters, go in peace. Serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.